President Nelson, my fellow Americans, I stand before you tonight humbly grateful to God for the blessings we all enjoy as citizens of these great United States of America. I am grateful for our founding fathers who were raised up with the courage to give their lives, with the unselfishness to give their fortunes, and the vision to pledge their sacred honor in order to establish a new kind of government of their own choosing, be free. I'm additionally grateful that these founding fathers had the faith and humility to accept the divine inspiration so necessary in setting forth a Constitution as the foundation for their new republic. I am honored with the privilege of addressing you tonight on the vital subject of the proper role of government. Men in the public spotlight constantly are asked to express an opinion on a myriad of government proposals and projects. What do you think of TVA? What is your opinion of Medicare? How do you feel about urban renewal? The list is endless. All too often answers to these questions seem to be based not upon any solid principle, but upon the popularity of the specific government program in question. Seldom are men willing to oppose a popular program if they themselves wish to be popular, especially if they seek public office. Such an approach to vital political questions of the day can only lead to public confusion and legislative chaos. Decisions of this nature should be based upon and measured against certain basic principles regarding the proper role of government. If principles are correct, then they can be applied to any specific proposal with confidence. Are there not, in reality, underlying universal principles with reference to which all issues must be resolved, whether the society be simple or complex in its mechanical organization? It seems to me we could relieve ourselves of most of the bewilderment which so unsettles and distracts us by subjecting each situation to the simple test of right and wrong. Right and wrong as moral principles do not change. They are actual and reliable determinants, whether the situation with which we deal is simple or complicated. There is always a right and a wrong to every question which requires our solution. Unlike the political opportunist, the true statesman values principle above popularity and works to create popularity for those political principles which are wise and just. I should like to outline in clear, concise, and straightforward terms the political principles to which I subscribe. These are the guidelines which determine now and in the future my attitudes and actions toward all domestic proposals and projects of government. These are the principles which, in my opinion, proclaim the proper role of government in the domestic affairs of the nation. I believe that governments were instituted of God for the benefit of man, and accountable for their acts in relation to them, both in making laws and administering them for the good and safety of society. I believe that no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience, the right and control of property, and the protection of life. I believe that all men are bound to sustain and uphold the respective governments in which they reside, while protected in their inherent and inalienable rights by the laws of such governments, and that sedition and rebellion are unbecoming every citizen thus protected and should be punished accordingly, and that all governments have a right to enact such laws as in their own judgments are best calculated to secure the public interest, at the same time, however, holding sacred the freedom of conscience. It is generally agreed that the most important single function of government is to secure the rights and freedoms of the individual citizens. But what are those rights? And what is their source? Until these questions are answered, there is little likelihood that we can correctly determine how government can best secure them. Thomas Paine, back in the days of the American Revolution, explained that rights are not gifts from one man to another, nor from one class of men to another. It is impossible to discover any origin of rights otherwise than in the origin of man. It consequently follows that rights appertain to man in right of his existence, and must therefore be equal to every man. The great Thomas Jefferson asked, "Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure? They have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are of the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath?" Starting at the foundation of the pyramid, let us first consider the origin of those freedoms we have come to know as human rights. There are only two possible sources. Rights are either God-given as part of the divine plan, or they are granted by government as part of a political plan. Reason, necessity, tradition, and religious convictions all lead me to accept the divine origin of these rights. If we accept the premise that human rights are granted by government, then we must be willing to accept the corollary that they can be denied by government. I, for one, shall never accept that premise. As the French political economist Bastia phrased it so succinctly, life, liberty, and property do not exist because men have made laws. On the contrary, it was the fact that life, liberty, and property existed beforehand that caused men to make laws in the first place. I support the doctrine of separation of church and state, as traditionally interpreted to prohibit the establishment of an official national religion. But I am opposed to the doctrine of separation of church and state as currently interpreted to divorce government from a formal recognition of God. The current trend strikes a potentially fatal blow at the concept of the divine origin of our rights and unlocks the door for an easy entry of tyranny. If Americans should ever come to believe that their rights and freedoms are instituted among men by politicians and bureaucrats, then they will no longer carry the proud inheritance of their forefathers, but will grovel before their masters, seeking favors and dispensations, a throwback to the feudal system of the Dark Ages. We must ever keep in mind the inspired words of Thomas Jefferson as found in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Since God created man with certain unalienable rights, and man in turn created government to help secure and safeguard those rights, it follows that man is superior to the creature which he has created. Man is superior to government and should remain master over it, not the other way around. Even the non-believer can appreciate the logic of this relationship. Now, leaving aside for a moment the question of the divine origin of rights, it is obvious that a government is nothing more or less than a relatively small group of citizens who have been hired, in a sense, by the rest of us to perform certain functions and discharge certain responsibilities which have been authorized. It stands to reason that the government itself has no innate power or privilege to do anything. Its only source of authority and power is who created it. This is made clear in the preamble to the Constitution of the United States, which reads, "We, the people, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." The important thing to keep in mind is that the people who have created their government can give to that government only such powers as they themselves have in the first place. Obviously, they cannot give that which they do not possess. So the question boils down to this: what powers properly belong to each and every person in the absence of and prior to the establishment of any organized governmental form? A hypothetical question? Yes, indeed. But it is a question which is vital to an understanding of the principles which underlie the proper function of government. Of course, as James Madison, sometimes called the father of the Constitution, said, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls of government would be necessary. In a primitive state, there is no doubt that each man would be justified in using force, if necessary, to defend himself against physical harm, against theft of the fruits of his labor, and against enslavement of another. This principle was clearly explained by Bastiat. Each of us, he says, has a natural right from God to defend his person, his liberty, and his property. These are the three basic requirements of life, and the preservation of any one of them is completely dependent upon the preservation of the other two. For what are our faculties but the extension of our individuality? And what is property but an extension of our faculties? Indeed, the early pioneers found that a great deal of their time and energy was being spent doing all three, defending themselves, their property, and their liberty, in what properly was called the lawless West. In order for man to prosper, he cannot afford to spend his time constantly guarding his family, his fields, and his property against attack and theft. So he joins together with his neighbors and hires a sheriff. At this precise moment, government is born. The individual citizen delegates to the sheriff their unquestionable right to protect themselves. The sheriff now does for them only what they had a right to do for themselves, nothing more. Quoting again from Bastiat, if every person has the right to defend, even by force, his person, his liberty, and his property, then it follows that a group of men have the right to organize and support a common force to protect these rights constantly. Thus, the principle of collective right, its reason for existing, its lawfulness, is based on individual right. So far, so good. But now we come to the moment of truth. Suppose Pioneer A wants another